Welcome to the Polgar Chess University. Our theme today will be ideas in the King's Indian. Especially if you're looking for an opening for black, this may be something to your interest. The King's Indian is one of the most flexible and universal openings you can look for. It pretty much starts out with the black knight developing, followed by black fianchettoing his bishop. The good news is black can kind of choose to do that against almost any white setup other than e4. So let's see how this game developed even though black chose a different move order to get there. White played c4, which starts out as an English, and as I mentioned, here black could just move his knight out, or even the pawn out and the bishop first and then the knight, and get to a typical King's Indian type of position. As you'll see, we'll get there through a different move order in this game, which was played by the legendary David Bronstein, who was once upon a time challenger for the World Championship, and his opponent in this game was Zita in a match between Prague and Moscow in 1946. This game is actually one of the key games in the King's Indian defense that made it attractive and popular to a lot of people for years to come. So Bronstein continued by playing e5, and white responded with knight c3, knight f6, knight f3, attacking the pawn on e5. Black protected the pawn, and white played d4, initiating an exchange of pawns in the center. Now black has of course a choice to trade immediately, to push through by advancing the pawn to e4, or to protect the pawn. Probably the best option is, as black chose in this game, is to play knight b to d7, protecting the pawn. g3, and now here we are, we're transposing over to the King's Indian by g6. Bishop g2, bishop g7, castle, and castle. Okay, so now we reached a very typical position that happens a lot in the King's Indian defense. And this particular setup, if you only look at the black pieces on the board, could be happening against almost any of the white setups, almost regardless of which variation white would choose. As I said, anything other than white playing e4, the king pawn move on move 1. So what are the strategies in this position for each side? Well, black, if he's allowed, he will try to push the e-pawn ahead and gain space. The catch is, for example, if black would have tried to do that on the previous move, the white knight would simply move away to g5, and all of a sudden there is a three-way attack on that one lonely advanced pawn on e4. The two white knights and the bishop from g2 are all aiming at it. And there is only one black knight on f6 that's guarding it. So therefore, black has no way to protect that pawn two more times in one move. So advancing the pawn, while strategically it would be a good idea, reality is that if the end result is that black will lose that pawn, then it's certainly something to avoid. So let's look at the position again after black castles. Black typically is trying to look for a very active play, as you shall see in this game, and white will try to prevent the e4 push by playing e4 himself, and white has a space advantage. So white is trying to not let black get as active as he'd like to be and kind of squeeze black into passivity. Especially one challenge for black is the bishop that's on c8. That has serious difficulties in finding a good place to develop to. In this position, two of the most common moves are to play e4 immediately for white, or to play h3, which we shall see later why can be very important to guard the g4 square to limit the black pieces from getting there. However, in this game, as I said, this was one of the earlier games in this whole opening. Theory wasn't developed yet, and players didn't know what the conclusions are on what the best move for white is. And white just kind of made a natural move by playing b3. Certainly not a mistake, although maybe a small inaccuracy. Black right now played c6. Again, a very typical move, primarily to open up the diagonal for the queen to appear and to attack from the side. Of course, the drawback of the move is that now that d6 pawn may become a target of attack, especially if you can imagine the d4 and e5 pawns disappearing. White continued with bishop to b2, a very natural move. Generally, after you play a move like b3, you do want to follow up with bishop b2. And black responded with rook e8. Now black is ready to try to push the pawn forward to e4, and therefore white wanted to make sure that doesn't happen and played e4 himself. Now it's important to realize that after pawn takes, which seems like winning the pawn on e4, it does not, because white will of course not capture with the queen, which would put the queen in a horrendous discovery situation when the black knight can just capture the pawn on e4. But instead the knight will capture back on d4, and that's exactly what happened in the game. And now the bishop protects that key e4 pawn. So now we have a very typical scenario where white has a nice space advantage, as black haven't crossed yet the 6th rank, and also a target, the d6 pawn. The d6 pawn can no longer guarded by any of the black pawns, and it is on a half-open file, so therefore it is a target for white to attack. It's black's turn now, and black played an interesting move, namely queen b6. It's probably a bit too early to bring the queen out, but if white doesn't continue precisely, black's plan will work. Now one good option would have been for white to play knight a4 and chase the queen back. Another reasonable option was to play h3, making sure the black knight doesn't end up on g4 as it later did in the game. White instead, any of those, continued with queen d2, a logical move connecting the two rooks. The attempt to win a pawn by a discovery with knight e4 opening up the diagonal of the bishop would not work, as the white knight can capture back, opening up for the defense the white bishop's diagonal towards d4. Going back, black of course chose a much better option, namely playing knight c5. So now the pawn on e4 is attacked the 3rd time, so black is threatening to capture it. And white was ready to protect the pawn by rook f to e1. And this is a situation when bringing the knight to g4 would look quite attractive. And then the idea would be to go to e5 with that same knight, and then with one of the two knights to jump into d3. That looks quite nice. Black instead made another move, another plan that's quite typical for this opening, namely to play a5 and trying to open the a file, so when white is trying to guard the e4 pawn as well as guarding on the a file, the rook on e1 may get overworked. What I'm referring to is that when black gets to push the pawn one move further ahead to a4 and then exchange pawns on b3, then the white rook on e1 may have difficulty hanging on to the e4 pawn as well as guarding the rook on the a1 square. And we shall see that in just a minute. White continued with rook a to b1, getting away from the a file when black proceeded with a4. So now the idea is to capture the pawn on b3, of course. If white would capture on a4, it would be best for black to move out from any potential discovered attack by white's bishop from b2 and just prevent all of that and move the queen to a6, attacking both the c4 and a4 pawns. White chose to retreat the bishop to a1. So now the rook from b1 protects the pawn on b3, and white's plan is to advance the b pawn to b4, chasing black's knight back. Black traded on b3, and the pawn captured back, and now we're getting to action time. The black knight moved to g4. Well, this is the move that we ideally want to prevent when we're thinking to play h3. So now on one hand, black is planning to move the knight to e5 and then to d3, but actually there are more concrete and dangerous threats involved in this combination as well. White was a bit careless and in fact provoked black by playing h3. At this moment, try to think what you would do if you were playing with the black pieces. See if you can come up with the same solution as Bronstein did. Well, retreating the knight to e5 certainly is a reasonable option, but not the very best either. Bronstein found the elegant sacrifice that started with rook capturing the bishop. If now white would choose to capture the knight on g4, then black would simply trade rooks on b1, and then bishop could capture white's pawn on g4, leaving black with an extra pawn. Okay, but the test of every combination is what if they accept the sacrifice? And so white did. And now comes the real surprise that most likely white has overlooked. And that is the knight sacrifice on f2. Wow, what a beautiful move. As you shall see, there are a lot of pins, forks, and discoveries involved here. If right now the king captures back, one of the great choices for black would be to simply play knight b3 when black is combining using a pin, the white knight on d4 is pinned, as well as a fork, attacking a whole bunch of pieces all at once. And in fact, after white moves the queen, and then the bishop captures the knight on d4 with a check, black in addition will capture the rook on a1 as well. Let's go back again and see what would happen if the queen would capture on f2 instead of the king. Then black would play knight d3, forking white's queen and rook and creating a discovered attack over the knight on d4 at the same time. Again, black attacking not only the knight on d4 but then additional pieces, because if you look, white has too many pieces on dark squares that the black bishop, after it gets to d4, can attack or even capture. Let's go back and see how the game itself continued. White moved his rook up to e3, trying to cover up that diagonal where the black queen is and potential discoveries and pins came about. Black now simply continued with capturing a pawn on h3. So where do we stand on the material scale right now? White has an extra rook versus black having an extra bishop and 2 pawns. So if you look at purely on the number scale, you'll see that it's about even. However, you can notice that the white king lost a lot of its security in the f and the h pawns. Also, black has a pair of bishops, and black has still a lot more tactical threats to come. King moved out of the check to h2, and now another fancy move, knight to f2, threatening to fork with knight g4. Well, the queen cannot capture the knight in a healthy way, because then the queen no longer protects on d4, and now the rook is in a pin, black winning material. Let's go back to the position when black played knight f2, and white responded to that by playing rook f3. Well, this is a situation when there are a number of good ways to go. Among them, the way that Bronstein continued, playing knight ce4. Now we can sense the trouble. The knight on d4 is hanging as it's being attacked twice with the queen and the bishop now. And white played queen f4. But this is one of those situations when it's never too late to make a mistake. For example, if black would get greedy and would try to capture the knight on d4, all of a sudden queen f7 followed by capturing the rook on e8 would result in checkmate in just a couple of moves. So have to be careful till the very end, never to underestimate the opponent's chances. So black had to make a better move and played knight g4 check. Now naturally the king needs to be careful where to move. If it moves to g1, then the knight on d4 will be captured with a check. Or if it would move to h3, that would step into a potential knight jump discovery. So the king pretty much had no choice but to move to h1. And now again, black still needs to worry and not capture the knight on d4 because queen would capture on f7. But black played a wonderful move, f5. Now no more threats on the white side. In the meantime, the white pieces are still hanging. You can see that white has 3 pieces right on the same diagonal with black's bishop on g7. That's of course a sign of trouble. Also, the white king is very delicately positioned, and white has to be very careful to avoid some knight f2 checks forcing the king onto a discovery, for example, in case the white knight from d4 would move. White continued by trading knights with knight e4, and the rook captured back, attacking the queen as well as the knight. Queen captured on d6, and the rook captured the knight. So after all the clouds have cleared, we can see that white has a rook, but black has an extra bishop, knight, and 2 pawns. So black at this point has significant material advantage, and still the white king is far being out of the woods. White queen moved to b8, pinning the bishop, and now a good defensive and offensive move at the same time. Rook d8 on one hand protected the bishop on c8, and on the other hand opened up the diagonal of the queen. So now some knight f2 checks are in the picture, and even perhaps more importantly, opened up the diagonal of the bishop as well, attacking the rook right away. White moved the rook to a8, when black followed with bishop e5, a very unusual position for a white queen being on b8. Only move queen a7. And now, of course, black being ahead in material, exchanging queens would be a healthy choice as well. but in view of the lack of safety for the white king, it's even better to keep the queens on the board. And black proceeded with queen b4. Black now has all kind of threats with rook d1 or queen e1, which white tried to prevent with queen g1, another awkward square for the queen. And now, out of nowhere, the queen comes back to f8. A very nice move coming from the other side, threatening with queen h6. And after bishop h3, queen h6, white actually resigned because next the black rook comes in to the first or second rank, depending how white continues, and white cannot avoid loss of further material. A brilliant game by David Bronstein, who did a whole lot in popularizing the King's Indian defense. Remember, back in the 1940s, the King's Indian was a very rare opening. It only became popular later thanks to Bronstein and some other Russian masters and grandmasters. And now let's see the jewel of the week. Here we are. In this position, black has a humongous material advantage. However, white has a far advanced pawn. So it seems that game over. The pawn, if it advances right away, the black queen will capture the new queen, and if the rook would want to come to the aid of the pawn, black will have enough time to move his bishop to g7 and again hold off that pawn. And yet, in a miraculous way, white can still save this game. I suggest you spend some time in figuring this cute tactic out on how white survives. And the answer to this beautiful, beautiful endgame is giving up our rook. By pinning the queen, queen has to capture, and now the pawn is ready to promote. But you may wonder, this is all nice and beautiful, but even though we have a queen, so does our opponent, and they have an extra 3 pawns even after right now the white queen would capture the bishop in the corner. But that's not what white had in mind. White had in mind a brilliant escape solution by giving the queen up as well. Wow, isn't that an amazing move? Now, black is in check, and the queen on a2 is attacked as well. Therefore, if black doesn't want to lose, they better capture the queen. And guess what? That results in stalemate. A truly beautiful composition by Hageman, also in 1946. Well, I hope you enjoyed this beautiful jewel, as well as learned some important motifs from the King's Indian. As I said, the beauty is you can play that very same setup that black used in his first 7-8 moves and use similar ideas almost regardless what white does. Of course, this is not to say that the King's Indian is a winning opening. However, you can get out of the opening with a decent position. There is not that much that you need to know to avoid getting in opening trouble. And you can get an active play. So if you like to attack, you feel you're good at tactics, at combinations, or you want to get better at it, the King's Indian is certainly a reasonable choice. I'll be back talking more about different King's Indian ideas in future lessons. So if you're interested in that, look out for it. However, even if King's Indian is not an opening that you'd like to play, it still has a lot of tactical ideas that we're discussing, so by no means it's wasted time in any case, because primarily we're focusing on the patterns, on ideas, and the specific opening moves are not the most important thing. Well, thanks for listening. Hope you enjoyed the lesson and be back next week for some more chess goodies. Bye-bye.